The cold came down off the high places with a voice in it. Not the long grey moan that walks the Cimmerian hills in any winter. This wind screamed, thin and far and unceasing, as if it had crossed something in the north it could not forget, and carried the memories south the way a wounded man carries an arrow he cannot pull. Conan stood outside Makur's door and listened to it. Cekim stood beside him, and the wind that tore at the Cimmerian's black mane did not seem to find the Easterner at all. Conan spoke without turning. "Easterner, you carry the face of a man who has already seen how this ends." Cekim was silent a moment. When he answered, his voice moved beneath the wind rather than against it.
I have.
He had not come alone in the way that mattered. He had brought a knowing with him, and the knowing had a name older than the hills they stood on. Morlana, the eternal champion who has carried the wheel through its long turning. 3,000 years gone, she wore the shape of Valairan the Pale, and in that shape stood upon the broken towers of Acheron as the empire of sorcerer kings went down into fire and dust, and watched the younger races come up out of the wreckage like grass through the bones of a burned field. Before the ash had cooled, Valairan gave prophecy. The wheel turned her, in the long centuries since, into Morlana, and the prophecy is moving now, 3,000 years late and exactly on time. A flood was coming for Cimmeria, not raid, not war as the clans had bled and reckoned war for 40 generations. A tide of the dead walked south out of Vanaheim with riders behind its eyes, called by something that breathed without lungs in a hollow under the world. And the fists that had been clenched against it in the Elder Pact had forgotten why they were clenched. But the fist could not strike while rot lived in the hand. Cekim had laid it out plainly, in the manner of a man who has seen tribunals convened in 100 ages under 100 skies. The chiefs of the Snowhawk and the Nightwolf would be called to judgment. Kulrath, who had sent the Black Crag into his own hills and named it Winter. Mordok, who had taken the blood price and called it necessity. They would stand before the gathered clans, and there would be no oratory, no kinshield, no cunning. The manner of the tribunal permitted none. Only truth would be left standing in that circle when the asking was done. Truth, and whatever men could still bear the weight of it. Conan looked north, where the dark lay on the hills like a held breath. The Cimmerians were a people of oath and steel, or they were nothing. If they were to stand as a people against what was marching, and they would stand because Crom's children did not know another way, then the rot had to be cut from the body of the oath first, cleanly, before the gathered eyes of every clan, so that when the dead came down out of the north, the living would meet them whole. The wind screamed on, telling its one story. Behind them, the fire in Makur's dwelling breathed low, and an old man sat with the Chronicle finally off his shoulders, waiting for what he already knew was coming up the path. Makur stood in the doorway of his dwelling, and the cold moved past him into the fire warmth behind, and he did not appear to feel either. Conan turned to the young ones. Brak, Vara, ride ahead, call the Tribunal. He let the words stand a moment in the cold. Tell your fathers truth will be spoken, and tell them this is not an ask. His eyes went north, then back. What comes from the north is a hunger that has waited 3,000 years. It is coming to collect. Brak did not ask. Vara did not hesitate. They had both looked into the Cimmerian's eyes and found no anger there, no urgency, none of the heat by which men betray that an outcome is still being decided. There was only inevitability in his gaze, the look of a man naming a thing that has already happened and is merely waiting for the world to catch up to it. They went to the horses. They rode out of the high country with the snow smoking off the ridges behind them. Two of the young blood of Cimmeria, carrying a summons no chief could refuse, and an accusation no father could outrun. And behind them, slower, came the rest. The Cimmerian, the Easterner, the Shemite witch, and the Queen of Conan. 4 shapes descending out of the high places like a weather front. Makur did not watch them go. He stood in the archway of his dwelling, stone against stone, and his gaze was set to the northwest, fixed, unhurried, the way an old man looks at a horizon he has been waiting on longer than the young have been alive. As if across all those leagues of pine and snow and silence, he could hear it. the dread that was marching on Cimmeria, 400 dead feet falling in step, and no breath among them. The fire behind him breathed. He stayed in the doorway a long time.
Brack and Vara went to the horses. Brack set his hand to the saddle and stopped. Vara had not yet mounted. She stood with the reins loose in her fist and looked at him across the two horses. And Brack looked back, and for a moment there was only the wind and the snow smoking off the ridge, and the old country watching them both the way it watched everything. Two roads lay before them, Snowhawk to the west, Nightwolf to the east, the way it had always been done, each child to each father, each summons to each hearth, the blood carrying word to its own blood and no further. It was the old way. It was also the way a man rode alone into country where the trust had died. Vara knew her father, Brack knew his, and both of them knew that a daughter come alone to Kulrath, or a son come alone to Mordak, carried a summons into a hall where the chief held every advantage, and the messenger held none. And the message that Conan had put in their mouths was not one a proud man took kindly, nor one a cornered man let walk back out the door unanswered. What comes from the north is not mercy. Tell your fathers truth will be spoken. Men had been knifed at their own fires for less. Vara's gray eyes held his. There was no fear in them. There was the cold reckoning of her clan, the weighing of a thing already half decided, waiting only for the other half to agree.
"We ride together,"
she said. Brack nodded. The nod carried all of it. The message would be delivered, both messages to both fathers, and they would deliver them whole and walk back out whole, because they would not be alone when the words landed. They mounted. They rode out of the high country with the snow smoking off the ridges behind them, east first toward the Nightwolf. Two of the young blood of Cimmeria carrying a summons no chief could refuse, and an accusation no father could outrun. While the young blood rode east, the hollow was already full. It had filled before the summons ever left Conan's mouth. The watchers on the high ranges had seen a thing and sent it down the mountain ahead of itself, and the clans had come up to the high camp the way they came when the north went wrong. Not for tribunal now, but for war, the hollow's other use, the older one. Snow drifted down into the bowl and did not settle on the men. There were too many of them, and the great fire stood open to the falling sky at the center, and the heat of the gathered clans held the cold off the stone. Snowhawk ranked along one curve of the fire, Nightwolf along the other, and out past them, back in the ring of standing stones where the rim of the bowl rose into pine and dark, stood the lower clans, the thin hearths, the small bloods, hunters in worn furs, and grey elders leaning on axes, the men who did not climb to the hollow unless the watchers called them down. They had climbed. That alone spoke. Whatever the great chiefs had let rot in the daylight, the old watch still held in the high cold, and the high cold had seen the thing and come down to say so. Kulrath and Mordak stood together at the fire, and the watchers came down to them by twos, 2 of Snowhawk's blood, 2 of the wolf's. Men who held the high ranges through the long dark, posted in pairs so no man's eyes stood alone, their women on the cold with them, for no man keeps a ridge a season and stays a man without one. They came down only when the north moved. The north had moved. The first to speak was a Snowhawk tracker with the frost still in his furs.
It is a tide of the dead.
He did not raise his voice. He had no need to.
We went up the Raven's Tooth to find the end of it. There is no end. As far down the range as the eye carries, and farther. It fills the passes. It comes over the dead ground where nothing has walked in an age. They do not march. They do not breathe.
He stopped. A Cimmerian counts what he can kill, and the count had broken in his mouth, and the breaking showed on his face.
Not hundreds, not thousands. There is no number cut for what comes.
The wolf scout beside him said only,
The eastern ridge showed the same. He speaks true.
Mordak did not look from the fire.
How many days? 5 nights. 6 if the snows come down and drag at them.
The tracker's jaw worked.
On the 6th they reach the northern threshold.
The first Cimmerian ground. The word went round the fire without a man speaking it. Culrath moved first. You climbed 1 tooth of rock, he rasped, counted the dark, and came back to 2 chiefs, calling it the end of the world. He turned on the trackers, all 4. A boy's fear dressed in a scout's words. Go up again, count again, bring me a number a man can stand on. The trackers did not flinch. They had seen it with their own eyes, and a chief's anger did not unsee a thing. The Snowhawk only held Culrath's gaze and said nothing, which was worse than anything he might have said. Mordak watched Culrath, not the watchers, Culrath. He had heard the other news himself, the way a chief hears everything, heard it come down quiet the same nights the watcher's word came down loud. The blades sent into the pass had not come back. The Cimmerian still walked, and there was a death in it closer to Culrath's own fire than mercenary blood. A nephew in the cold ground who should have been standing at this one. The man raging at trackers was not raging at trackers at all. Mordak took him by the arm, not gently. He turned Culrath half off the fire and into himself, close, so the warriors saw 2 chiefs in council and not what passed between them. And he gave Culrath the look, the one a chief keeps for the moment the man beside him begins to come apart where the clans can see it. Flat, hard, no pity in it, and no anger either. Only the iron fact of where they stood. The lower clans were watching the 2 great chiefs to know whether to stand or to break. Not here, the look said. Whatever you have lost, not here. The fire cracked between them. 5 nights to the north, and on the eastern road, 2 of the young blood were already riding up toward this same fire, carrying a summons to call to judgment the very men now holding the gate of Cimmeria. They rode through the corridors of the grey mountains, east toward the Night Wolf, and the wind came down off the high places with that thin, far scream still threaded through it. Then the horses knew before the riders did. Both mounts threw their heads at once and stopped, not shied, stopped, hooves locking on the cracked stone as if the ground ahead had become a cliff edge. Brack's hand was on his axe before his mind had named a reason. Vara's reins were already short, her black long sword half clear of its sheath, her body turned to put the blade between herself and the thing taking shape on the flat before them. The air was tearing, not opening, tearing, a wound in the world's grey skin, and from its edges black tendrils unwove themselves into being, weaving outward in a geometry no hand had drawn, thorned and barbed and curling like the legs of something vast turned inside out. They braided into a ring, and the ring stood taller than a man on his horse, and at its heart hung a dark that was not shadow and not night, but the plain absence of the world, ringed in a thin seam of ember red that pulsed once, slow, like a coal breathing. The mountains went silent. Even the wind held off it, as though the scream in the air would not come near the thing. Brack's horse trembled under him and did not bolt. That was the wrongness that put the ice in his spine. The animal should have run mad. It stood instead, shuddering, white-eyed, held, as if the tear had reached out and laid a stillness on it, the way a hand stills a struck bell. Vara did not speak. Her grey eyes were fixed on the dark at the ring's heart, her sword up, her breath drawn and held behind her teeth. Brack matched her, axe lifted, weight set, both of them braced at the edge of a thing their whole lives in these hills had given them no name for. Something was coming through. They could feel it gathering in the absence, the way you feel a tread in the ground before you hear the foot. They held their breath and waited to see what horror would step out of the wound in the world. Conan walked out of it.
Juramento manet, hermanos nostras. Juramento manet, te celebras frangi. Juramento manet, hermanos nostras. Juramento manet, ad hoc pugnat. Bra! Non mortui surgunt, non umbre redeunt, sed voluntas patrum iterum ambulat. In carne, in ossibus, in pugno clauso. Close the fist on the word. Substellis frigidis, expectavimus. Non ex ira, non ex odio, non ex fame, ex juramento, unus gradus, una marus, una veritas contact finis. Tenebrae creverunt, nos quoque tempus transit, nos mansimus erbum factum est, pugnus factus est, landit. Per montes, per ventus, per saecula obscura, patres vocant.